Andrea, so good to have you here.
Bradley, thank you for having me.
It's my absolute
Thank you
pleasure.
for being here as well.
Well, I will say thank you for creating such a beautiful book. Adapt. It's such a great read, or I should say in my case, listen. And I find that, books that play along the line of, business and professional development can be a little dry, but yours certainly isn't. You're great at telling a story that's likely got a lot to do with your background in journalism. But there's so much I want to talk about today that I think is relevant to the people who listen to or watch this show, who are in the stage of their life in which I think we're always adapting, as you allude to in the book. But they're at a potentially very critical stage of their life where they're making big decisions that potentially influence the rest of their life from a career standpoint, family standpoint, and financial standpoint. And the first chapter of the book, the introduction that is titled Be the Pilot, Not the Passenger, which has a couple of personal links as well as makes a lot of sense from a self-authorship perspective. But I know that your dad was a pilot, and I know that an Air Force pilot actually saved your life early in your career days. So I'm going to throw that out to you and let you talk about that as you will.
Well, first of all, I think business books are mostly boring. I'm going to be controversial, but I believe there's a way to, I believe that business books can be sexy. We can sex them up a bit with some real stories and lived experience. And I think for me, that is what is missing mainly across the business management, category of books. And that is the lived experience that brings those stories alive and shows us that there are lessons that we can apply really important lessons from our personal lives and those experiences into the workplace and into every part of our lives. So I'm glad you like it. Yeah.
It's a really, really enjoyable listen. So talk to me about this idea of being the pilot, not the passenger, because I think that's something that really well applies to every area of your life. It obviously has in yours.
Definitely. And I had a very early and very powerful lesson in the role of adaptability and the role of high agency. And that story happened when I was probably about 12 years old. I was in a Cessna 210 light aircraft single engine that was being piloted by my father, and I was in the plane with my two sisters. And Dad thought he was getting Dad wanted 3 boys and he got 3 girls, so he didn't treat us any different, which was a great thing. But he was flying us from a cotton farm in Moree into the Gold Coast, and at 9,000 feet we had engine failure. And what happened in that moment and the way he responded taught me everything I wanted to know about really how to live my life on my own terms. And what happened in that moment is he very calmly and in a very composed manner passed a map to my older sister to his right and said, "Find me a place to land," while he workshopped the problem and figured out what was going on with the engine. And made those decisions about how far the range we had on the amount of power we had, which wasn't very much. And it wasn't IQ or EQ that helped him land that plane in one piece. It was his AQ. It was his adaptability quotient, his ability to apply new thinking to new problems. So he literally was looking up and out over the dash, because if you've been in a light aircraft, you know that it's quite high. Like, it's not like driving a car. He was looking up and out at where to land the plane, while at the same time looking at the instruments, figuring out how much fuel do we have, how long, what is our range. We had about 50 Ks, I think, to land. And so we glided for 9,000 feet. And then the last 2,000 feet, he put the nose down, and because we only had one shot at this particular runway on a very remote farm in Western Queensland. And through that experience, he very calmly said to us something to the effect of, "I'm going to figure out what's going on, and if I ask you to do anything, I just need you to do it." And the 3 of us were like, definitely. Like, it didn't take much for JC, John, it didn't take much for JC to bring us into line, and he certainly did in that moment. But there was no moment in that chaos where we felt in danger. And what I loved about adaptability and seeing it live in action is adaptability gives you options. Adaptability gives you confidence to negotiate untested scenarios. And high AQ gives you an ability to negotiate moments with confidence, kind of back yourself in to know that, yes, we might be experiencing a degree of uncertainty here, but we're all going to be okay. So he landed the plane safely. And I've carried that moment with me forever. And that was the day I realised, in some small way that, if something goes wrong, who do you want at the wheel? I don't want someone who is panicking and reactive. I want someone who's ready, and that's who I want to be. I want to be ready and prepared for change, and I want to be constantly looking up and out to understand what is changing around me so I can respond to that, because the earlier we spot signals of change, the more time we have to respond to it. And Dad, by the time of that incident, he had 3,000 hours up in a light aircraft and in a simulator and with a training instructor, where in a mid-air drill, the instructor would turn the engine off and say, you've got to restart the engine and get us, back to where we need to be. And so in a way, his brain had been there before. He was wired for change. So I feel it's so important for us to develop that mental flexibility so we can rewire our response to change in moments where we feel uncertain.
I love that we've started here, because I think the thing that really pricked my ears up about that story, aside from how entertaining it is, it feels like the start of a TV show or a movie, is the fact that you made the comment, especially at a young age, that you never felt in danger in that moment. I think it says something about, we spoke about just off camera before, that topic of agency, which I know you love to discuss. And having those high agency people in your life, there's a great George Mack, who I mentioned, who's just written a lot about this recently. He's got a website actually called highagency.com.
Love it.
So great domain.
Yeah.
And he was saying that the highest agency person in your life is the person you'd call if you had one call to make from a prison in South America. It's like, who's the one person that, regardless of context or information, could figure this out?
I love that.
And I'm like, that sounds like for you at a very young age, it was your dad.
Yeah.
And it makes me think that's the kind of person I think we should all aspire to be. The person that keeps their cool in the order of chaos.
Yeah.
The person who can find a way through the forest when you can't see, more than your next step.
The person who exercises authority and who exercises real leadership in those moments that matter. We definitely need those people around us. And I know from a very young age, I have looked for that type of leadership. And, it took me a while to find in my professional life, but I had an exceptional role model in my father from a very young age. And Dad never worked for anyone. He grew up in a caravan outside of Melbourne that burnt down when he was quite young. So he grew up with no photos, nothing to reflect on. And we've often, my sisters and I, and we often talk about, like, where did Dad get this from? But, he is an absolute self-made individual. He retired at 35, but said to us all, the only thing he was giving us was our education, and he was not kidding. It was no exaggeration. But he was very successful from a very young age, but got his hands dirty in a trucking haulage business in Western Queensland. So I had the ultimate role model growing up, like just getting shit done, making things happen in ways that, you rarely see around you. But I agree with you. The way we define role models needs to be clear. Like, we need to base role models around why people do what they do and not what they do. And I think that's the issue we have today, which I feel strongly about, particularly on behalf of your audience, is, I do not believe role models should be based around money, power, or fame. It's why. Like, why are people doing what they do? I think we need a bit of a reckoning around role models, and we need to be clear on what they look like, because they need to be a positive influence over us. It's about demonstrating good behaviours, good ethics, and I wish that more of us were looking at people and redefining what role models really are to us these days.
It's very interesting you say this, because one of the, I guess, really interesting studies of the last decade is seeing that when these school kids at the age of, say, 10 are surveyed on what they want to be when they grow up, the rising popularity of this idea of being an influencer and how, when you exist in the world that I do right now, the podcast world, and you get to speak to a lot of different people, you realize pretty quickly that influence online means very little about financial security, means very little about character, and it can be at times, not all the time, but at times quite performative.
Of course. Yeah.
And so there's a kind of delusion that comes with this idea of that's who you want to be, because it's not a very solid thing to aspire for.
It's a long game. Life is a long game. And when I see people behaving in ways where their intentions are only about the attention grab. I worked in television for 17 years, and I can tell you, it's just irrelevant. It's a very short game if you're going for the attention grab. And my nephew said to me about a year ago, because I asked him, I think he's about 12 now, and I said, what do you want to be when you leave school? And he said, I want to be a YouTuber. And I was like, I've got a bit of work to do here. That is not, what our kids aspire to be needs examination.
For sure. I think it's often forgotten that a lot of the people who have success in these spaces that keep it for a long time, the fame or the notoriety is a byproduct of doing something very well, as opposed to aspiring for or striving for fame in the first place. Very prickly game. But I want to touch on something. So you're talking about being high agency and being, high AQ. We're at the moment in a very challenging time economically, where a lot of young people are feeling the strain of the desire to get into the market, the desire to create some kind of financial security, not even abundance, but just security and consistency in their life. And there seems to be almost two headspaces that I see playing out in society at the moment. One is to absolutely, with every bit of your might, fight the system. And I agree that the system isn't exactly serving us, right? But as a human being who hates giving up any sort of control or autonomy of my life, I probably sit in the other camp, which is, what do I have to be and who do I have to become in order to make sure that whatever's happening out there doesn't affect me and my family in here? And for people who hear that and like the idea of having a little bit more autonomy, this book is going to be great for them. But particularly, what are some of the themes that you touch on in the book that you think could be helpful for someone trying to transition from, dare I say, more of a victim mindset into more of a high agency person?
It's a great question, and it's difficult to feel like we have a lot of control when interest rates are at 7% and people are hurting and many small businesses are going under, or people are voluntarily folding them because the government makes it too hard to start up and run a small business. So what I want to say to anyone who's listening to this, it doesn't matter how old you are, is that you don't have to be young. You don't have to be young male to feel like you can't get it together, or you don't have to be young to think, how do I find financial security? I've got many friends in their mid-40s asking the exact same questions. And I come back to being clear on what we can and can't control. And that's, that's the central theme about agency. To be a high agency individual, that is about acting as an effective agent for yourself and understanding that you get to decide how you feel about things that happen to you. And you also need to be clear on what you can and cannot control. Now, we can't control interest rates, but we can control what we're spending, how we spend our time, and who we spend it with. And perspective is a really valuable piece in this discussion, right? So I want you to think back, I want everyone who's watching or listening to think back 10 years and even scroll back. Get on Instagram, get on any social media app you have, and go back to the very first post you ever made and think about, what was that? What was the first thing I ever posted? And was it 10 years ago? Doesn't matter when it was, but I want you to think about where were you at in that moment? What did life look like for you? And what's been the biggest change for you in 10 years? How far have you come? Because I think that when we think about change, we automatically default to thinking about change as a loss in the moment. And in the moment, it does feel like a loss of security. A loss of, if you lost your job 10 years ago, that would have been devastating. That's a loss of security. It's a loss of status. It's a loss of friends and colleagues in the workplace. And that loss is real. You know, for many of us, that's real in the moment. What I think is really interesting about change and perspective is when we have time and distance from a change moment, we often see the upside in change. And I feel like you could see that in your own life.
Oh, for sure.
How much you've gained in the last 10 years in your life through what you've been through. And that's a valuable exercise for all of us to run, you know, often and routinely, because that perspective gives us the strength and the courage to keep moving forward and to move forward with intention. You know, when I think about the last 10 years and the changes that I've been through, there have been many moments where I think that change moment I've defaulted to loss, but with time I have seen the gains, and I think we need to be reminding ourselves that when we feel like life is getting really difficult, we should never underestimate how much change we're capable of and what we learn and how we grow from those change moments. And that is a very important part of developing adaptability, developing high AQ, and developing a high sense of agency. Does that make sense?
It makes
that
perfect
reflection.
sense.
And I bet, I mean, I hope everyone's thinking, what's the biggest change I've been through in the last 10 years? And in the moment, it doesn't always feel good, but give it time and you'll see how it allows you to grow if you are looking for the upside in change. And pilots do this every time they get into the simulator. I interviewed Captain Richard de Crepney, who was a Qantas pilot of the A380.
I'd love to have him on the show.
Yeah, he's so fascinating. I spent 90 minutes with him and it felt like a real privilege. And I talked to Richard about this, and he landed that A380 with 479 people on board after it blew an engine out of Changi. And we were talking about pilots do this every time they get into the simulator, and we need to find our own simulator, our own biodome to get into once in a while. For many of us, that's an infrared sauna, which is where I find, complete peace from the world. But we have to get into that simulator. And pilots run through the what-if scenarios, right? What if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to be better prepared for change? And of course, they're often, the bend for them is a negative because they're training for a negative to protect everyone who's on board. And I think that we can add a positive and say, well, what if losing my job allows me to do something that I really love doing? Or what if breaking up from that relationship allows me to move to a city that I've always wanted to move to? Like, what's the upside in that moment instead of the downside? And I think we need to rewire ourselves to be not just better prepared for change, but to always find the upside, find the opportunity in that moment that feels like a loss, because there is always opportunity there. We just don't necessarily realise it at the time.
It's really interesting you say this. So I did a campaign, like collaboration last year with a mental health organisation who have been on the show, the boys at Speak and Share. Incredible organisation. They're doing great work. And we kind of told my story behind the release of merchandise that was going to go back and fund their school programs. And the story we told on the hoodie was, you can be anything, so why not be positive? Which is very much a tip of the hat to the kind of perspective that I've tried to hold in my life. However, the interesting thing is I feel it raised a couple of questions around some people who talked to me about the idea behind the campaign in, are you just positive all the time? And I'm like, oh, it's really interesting because I should probably clarify that no, that's not the case. I recently heard Toto Wolff, the principal of Mercedes F1. Yeah, and great voice, handsome cat, great at his job.
Lots of charisma going on there.
Lots of charisma. And he was saying on an interview that he's actually a glass half empty kind of person. He said, to be effective in my role, I find that being able to spot the negative and then change it and adapt makes me successful, and has meant that we've had so much success at Mercedes. I thought it's a really interesting point to make that it's not exactly about, and we're actually not wired as humans, I don't think, to perceive the positive immediately, but rather it's your ability to see the challenge or the potential negative, for lack of a better phrase, and filter it through to what can the positive be, as you said.
You've got to convert it. So what I find really fascinating is about the human psyche is that we are addicted to sameness. We love our routine. That's why we order the same coffee every day, right? We've got to work really hard to break that script and to re-edit the script in a way that's going to work for us. And I couldn't agree more. And I've applied that to myself in many career scenarios where And this is what the book is about. It's about how do we engage with those signals of change and give ourselves time to process and respond in a way where we can be an active player in what that change looks like and how the change lands around us. So the 4 principles in the book are engage, accept, activate, and release. And that is an approach to change which has served me very well. That's why I've written about it. And I hope will serve others, because we need to be engaged in those signals of change in order to be an active player in our own life and give ourselves the time to convert a loss to a gain. Secondly, accept. We need to accept what's changing around us. We can't sit in the acceptance place for too long, because we forfeit the opportunity to change and change well. And thirdly is activate. Activating our optimism and our energy for change. Something might be tough, but how do we make the most of that for ourselves? And then release is about what do we need to let go of in order to free up the brain space, the very valuable brain space that we need to take on what's coming next, what is no longer fit for purpose. That could be what's out of date. I mean, we've all collected, well, maybe you didn't, but, we've all collected DVDs for, way back that were not relevant. So it's like, what are we collecting that's not relevant for us anymore? Is it an outdated belief? Is it an outdated piece of technology? Is it something that is just causing us a burden in some way? What do we need to if we're really honest with ourselves, what do we need to release in order to free up all that energy we need for what's next? So engage, accept, activate, and release. Those are the 4 steps and 4 principles that I believe have genuinely helped me be able to anticipate and influence change and not feel like I'm falling behind and not feel like I'm always playing catch up. And I'll give you a real life example if you don't mind. So
please.
In 2008, first of all, I moved myself to Washington, D.C. When I was in my late 20s, because I always wanted to be a correspondent, always wanted to live in Washington. And I moved over, so it was my dream gig. There was a lot that I had attached to that, in a way. And in 2008, I was walking down the street. Life was grand. I had all my friends worked in the White House. I had this amazing job freelancing as a TV reporter and producer with Reuters, Al Jazeera English, the 7 Network, and the Pentagon Channel. So my job was to cover State Department, Pentagon, White House, all breaking news out of North America. It was pretty exciting. Very addictive to be part of an ultra high performance team that covered news. Taught me a lot about the dynamics of trust. And one day I was walking to the Al Jazeera bureau on K Street, and you really feel like you're centre of the universe in Washington, that's for sure, especially when the Obama administration was in office. I was walking down the street, and for the first time in my career, I did not pick up a copy of the New York Times or a newspaper. And if you're a journo, you never walk into the newsroom not knowing what's going on. You're scanning the headlines before you go in. So you've got some idea about what you're going to be assigned for the day. But instead of picking up a newspaper from a newsstand, I was reading the news on my BlackBerry, on my smartphone. And I stopped and I thought, wow, I am a journalist who's paid to produce content. But as a consumer, I'm not prepared to pay for it. Right? Interesting moment. And I literally stopped on the sidewalk and I thought, this is a really interesting signal of change. And the signal of change is me. It's my behaviour. So what if my behaviour scales? What if 10,000 people stop picking up a newspaper? This is 2008. What if 1 million people stop watching the 6 p.m. news? What does life look like then for a TV reporter who's already working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and only earning a barely livable wage? So I had 100 feet between that moment and getting into the bureau. And in that 100 feet, I started running scenarios in my head. What if this gets worse? What if life gets harder for me? And none of the scenarios I liked at all. So I started thinking, what if I left journalism now? Like, what if I opted out now and upskilled in other areas so I could be better prepared for this change? Because it was clear to me in that moment that the business model of news was failing right in front of me and I was a part of it. And I went up to the newsroom, and I so clearly remember saying to my colleagues, hey, just out of interest, have you got a plan B? Like, what would you do if you weren't coming into the newsroom every day? What would you do if this bureau shut down? And everyone said to me in separate private conversations, oh, that is ridiculous. That is never going to happen. We're in television. That's what people would say to me. We're in television. People very attached to their status and their identity as news reporters. And I thought, that doesn't sound good to me. And I, in a matter of weeks, resigned, walked out on my very amazing career because I knew I wanted to be 5 to 10 years ahead of this enormous wave of change that was coming our way as reporters. And of course it did. So I stepped out and I went to work in humanitarian aid, and I ended up working not long after that, getting a job, a phenomenal job, working in a major aid organisation to bring relief to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But that was my moment of change where I realised when I'm running all these what-if scenarios, which is what a pilot does, they run these what-if scenarios. What if that happens? What if this happens? But as I said, they're skewing towards the negative. It's okay to recognise what the negative is, but what's important is interrupting that script that we have, that default pattern of thinking, and think, what's the positive here? What if this change allows me to upskill and be 10 years ahead of everyone else when they realise that the business model is failing and life is going to look a lot harder for people who don't see that change. And it's very disruptive, by the way.
It is.
Like, I put my life in a blender and threw a grenade in there a couple of times. But I knew if I didn't do that, someone else was going to do that for me. And that was going to be far more painful and disruptive than me taking control of what that change was going to look like. And so when we talk about what we can and can't control, we've got to be realistic. There are a lot of things we can't control, but we've got to look at what's our response and our behaviour in that moment where we know change is going to be disruptive. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. But it's way more painful when someone else forces that change on you, I think.
Let me bundle all of that all
sure.
together and
That's
pull on a thread. So, no, because that's a bloody brilliant story. I have a lot of questions for you for context. The first being, did at that stage, like to make that decision of literally picking up and putting down what you were doing in a moment, and to then go and completely change your career a few weeks later, did you still love it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's nothing more addictive than walking into a newsroom, and I did this for 17 years, walking into a newsroom, not having any idea how the day was going to play out, right? If your general assignment, anything is coming your way, can you go and jump in the helicopter and cover that bushfire? The PM's in town for the morning. Can you go to a live cross, wherever that is? Can you go and interview Christopher Hitchens and search up who he is, because he was a phenomenal, fiery mind, which is very intimidating to interview. Oprah is going to be on the red carpet at the Kennedy Center Awards tonight. Go get a grab from Oprah. No kidding. And days like that were a real adrenaline rush because you walked into the newsroom having no idea what was coming your way, but you knew you were going to learn something. You knew you were going to be out of your comfort zone, and you had to find a way to stay composed and communicate change to the audience, regardless of how you felt in that moment. So being part of a news team was highly addictive, and it was a very difficult thing to let go. But I had to convert that to another field and still find a way to be challenged, which of course, it's pretty easy to be challenged when you land in Baghdad, but find ways to be challenged in different contexts. And that was up to me, how I converted that change into something that still felt very meaningful and still allowed me to deliver in ways that I hope lifted other people.
Let me ask you a question, because I think you're wired very differently to most people. Like, for most people, I was thinking about this on my line bike ride from my very distant car park this morning, is, change is as good as a holiday. So everyone says, yet we're so resistant to it.
I know.
Right. And it sounds like, regardless of the resistance you feel, whatever decision-making matrix you go through to get there is somewhat different to the average person. But I'm curious what drives that. So, like, what are the values or the purpose that you feel are true to you, that allow you to make those decisions and leave something you love in order to find something else?
The role of learning is fundamental to, that's a fundamental anchor for me, fundamental value for me. The role of learning, because learning is adapting and adapting is learning. And so I think that's why I went into journalism, because I valued learning, as a core factor in how I wanted to live my life. And every day you walk into a newsroom, you're learning something. You're learning something about yourself. You're learning something about your colleagues, your family, the community, the world. And it's an awesome opportunity to meet people who can further, who somehow just make you feel like a better person because you're in the same room as them. And so I think undeniably on reflection, being a TV news reporter in the field is a daily practice in exercising adaptability. And it is a daily practice in understanding the phenomenon of learning, and what a wonderful place it is to deliberately and intentionally put yourself in a place where you are learning every day. So my training and my career in news reporting is undeniably for me, was just such a powerful training ground in understanding what we're really capable of when we're open to learning and open to understanding something new, and being just forever curious, and being okay with uncertainty and whatever comes next. But I just think learning is everything, and I always want to be in a position where I'm learning. And so that means your adaptability is sort of naturally heightened because you're learning what's possible, and I'm always asking what is possible. I guess I've just never fallen into a pattern of being a victim to change. I've always, and it goes back to that early lesson with Dad flying that day, I always wanted options, and I want options for other people around me as well. And so I think that's why, I've loved journalism. I've loved facilitating leadership cohorts with massive businesses around the world, and sharing, basic lessons that are not skills. Like, adaptability is not a skill. It is a liberating mindset shift. To live your life with a high level of adaptability means that you're not distracted by other things that distract other people. You're paying attention to what is going on around you. You're interested in how things are changing and how things might play out. So that's what journalism taught me every day. Because every day is a day in exercising 1,000 different micro adaptations. You're dealing with changing technology, changing weather. You're dealing with people. You're dealing with hundreds of things that change every day. And so rapid change becomes the norm, and high stakes change becomes the norm. So when you are working at a pace where you're dealing with change, every 5 minutes, it becomes a mindset that's difficult. You don't just leave that behind. You don't leave it in the newsroom. You come out of the newsroom, you leave the newsroom at the end of the day, and you walk out onto the street. And if you're not picking up a newspaper, you're taking notice of that. And you're being very intentional about how you want to move forward. So it's a mindset. It's a mindset shift, I think, being highly adaptive.
You've heard of Naval Ravikant?
No.
Very successful guy. He was just recently on another podcast after a 10-year hiatus.
Right.
I guess you could say the podcast community, or at least the podcast community I exist in, was very excited about his return.
Okay.
But there was a great quote in the episode that really struck a chord with me. He said, "The only true test of intelligence is getting what you want. The other is knowing what to want in the first place." Knowing what to want, I think, is a very interesting topic to discuss. You spoke about learning. You mentioned in the book that there has been a high uptake of freelance work in the modern world due to the change that we experienced through COVID. You mentioned, though, that a very important question to ask yourself if you're going to get into freelance work: do I like to learn? Learning for me probably doesn't come as naturally in all areas as I'd like it to, but in the areas that I know I really want to learn, my uptake is fast. So let's talk about that motivation, because you strike me, correct me if I'm wrong here, as the kind of person that I could put a Chinese lecture book in front of and your uptake would be pretty quick. You'd find a way to get interested. Is that a fair
I
statement?
think when you're on deadline for 17 years, there's no option. You actually don't have an option. Like if you're, and that's my conditioning. So when you get assigned something, you think, I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I've got to, because at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m, there are going to be 500,000 people looking at me doing a live shot. I have to figure out how to get from here to there.
Can I ask you a question? Because most people will hear that, and like something that popped to the forefront of my mind then was to ask you whether that's fear that's motivating you. But I don't think for you it is. It's that desire to be high agency. But for a lot of people who are maybe listening to this and reading the change, seeing those signals that are playing out in modern society, the fact that the use of AI in their jobs, AI not maybe taking their jobs, but rather someone who knows how to use it. And they're seeing these conditional changes that are starting to catch up to their workplace pretty quickly. For a lot of people, it's going to be fear that motivates them before it's a desire to be high agency.
I think we need to replace fear with critical thinking. So there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, obviously. But to be high agency is to look at all that hype and think this is bullshit. You know, the AI that we should be hyping is our adaptive intelligence. That is what we should be hyping.
I like that. Stick that, you robots.
Yeah, and when I talk to AI experts, they say the same thing as economic historians who have looked at change and tech developments for, decades and generations. And AI experts say to me, we need to be less obsessed with AI and more obsessed with understanding how to use it effectively. So I think to be high agency is simply about being a critical thinker. Don't fall in line with everything that you're hearing. Like look at that broader pattern and say, I'm not signing up, I'm not subscribing to that narrative that is putting the fear of God into most people in society. What I'm going to do instead is get on the free version of ChatGPT and figure out how I can use AI to bring efficiency to my day. How do I use AI to, free up time for myself? How do I use it to become an expert on something I didn't know about 5 minutes ago? Like, how do I use it effectively instead of burning up time unnecessarily, being afraid of it? And I don't know if I'm, when you said before, driven by fear. No, I'm not driven by fear. I don't really know what it is, but I just love to learn, and I think it's a really wonderful thing to challenge the bias that we have, challenge the conditioning that we have, and always understand that what is true now may not be true in 5 minutes. It may not be true in a year. And I thought there was the most brilliant example of this through the LA fires, which no doubt many of us were watching live because it was so dramatic and chaotic. What stood out to me in that coverage was the morning of the fires coming down to the Palisades. I was watching a life coach, and every morning before she starts work, she'd do a mile around the neighbourhood. She'd walk a mile around the neighbourhood. And when she walked out, she saw the flames, and you could overhear in the audio, her saying to her neighbour, but I've still got to get my mile in. When it was so obvious that the flames were roaring down the canyon and were clearly about to take out the neighbourhood, her brain, she was so addicted to her routine that she was overheard saying, but hang on, I've got to get my mile in, right? She did go back, packed up her family and evacuated. And as we know, the Palisades were completely wiped out. But there was a very different story going on across the other side of the canyon. And that was a guy who a couple of years beforehand had seen how close the fires got. So he went out and bought sprinklers and attached them to the entire perimeter of his home. He sprayed his home in fire retardant. He turned the sprinklers on full ball, and then he evacuated. He saved his home. And what did not surprise me about that guy is that he was an army vet. He had spent his life training for change. He knew that the true definition of adaptability is not just about responding and reacting, it's about anticipating and influencing change. He was an active player in the signal of change that was so clear to him, and he wasn't going to be taken down by it. So I thought that was a brilliant example of two very distinct mindsets that kind of were fixed mindset and an open mindset. And for me, that demonstrated adaptability in its purest form. how am I not going to be reactive and a victim to change? How am I going to anticipate how that change is going to impact me and do something about it before it arrives? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I recently had Heston Russell on, former Australian Commando. Such a great dude. God, we had fun chatting in
Legend.
here. And, we were talking about the high performance mindset of being a commando. And this idea that he explained around the kind of presence it takes to act with high performance.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that story because, I'm a relatively routine-driven person, but not so much that I used to be so routinely driven that the slightest change in routine would set my day in a negative direction. And I think it's because I'd attached the newfound success that I had and the newfound good feeling of, my energy and how I went about my day to the routine of my morning from my 5 till 9. But I realized pretty quickly that it's actually quite a fragile way to live.
Yeah, it is.
That this idea that your morning routine is the determining factor of your success.
Yeah.
Even for some people, for the week, it can be a chaotic spiral.
That's a disruptive. You're asking to be disrupted by the smallest thing then, aren't you?
100%.
Yeah.
And, I heard somebody say that, America was built on the back of men who slept 5 hours and smoked cigarettes. So it's an interesting idea to look at this, great to optimize when you can, but ultimately the goal should be to maximize.
You've got to be flex. You've got to be flex. Like, this is why I say to people, if you want to know how simple adaptability is, and if you want to start developing your adaptability, the book is filled with about 14 high AQ habits, but one of them I didn't put in the book. I don't know. It just didn't occur to me until afterwards, but is to order a different coffee every day. Because even breaking that script helps you rewire, helps you be more prepared for change, helps you just be a bit looser and more flex with your mindset. And I would agree, you can't be anchored in everything being the same. And I think, again, that's why we have to deliberately counter what we love. Like I said, we're addicted to sameness. We are wired for routine. That's how our brains are built. And so when you challenge that, when you counter that script in really small ways, you start flexing the way you think about things. So for me, many years in journalism prepared me for landing in Baghdad, landing in an active war zone, and understanding that while I felt in some ways very much in danger, while I was in a very dangerous context, I still had gone through lots of preparation, and there were things in place to protect me as best as possible. So it's just impossible to operate in that context in any different mindset. I remember the first few mornings being woken up by car bombs. There was gunfire all day. And if you can choose to be paralysed by that, or you can choose to focus on what needs to be done in spite of that. And so I think that obviously many of us are addicted to those morning routines, and we see so much of it on Insta.
Have you seen the latest one?
What is it?
Jacked American dude. He's a former college football running back or something. Mate, let me tell you, guy's got some discipline because he's diced.
Sure.
Looks like he'd barely fit through a door. But he wakes up at 2:30 in the morning, face in the bucket of ice.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sits there with his nose strip on, dialing on the computer. I mean, and it's very funny. Credit to the guy. He's obviously successful in whatever he does.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is if you see that and you think that you need to do that in order to have success, you've already missed the point of it.
The happiest, the healthiest, the most resilient, and the most successful leaders all have one thing in common, and that is high AQ. There's a 20-year Harvard study of 1,000 American leaders that shows it's not charisma and it's not ice buckets that make us the most successful leaders. It's our ability to read a room and make decisions before everyone else. It's our ability to adapt early and our ability to be flexible in our thinking, our ability to unlearn the habits, behaviours, mindsets and skill sets that are no longer fit for purpose. It's that ability to understand what is changing outside of us and what is changing inside of us and bring alignment with those two kind of categories and figure out a way to move forward. And that for me, that's about paying attention. And that was my training as a reporter. You have to be paying attention because my job was to report on trends, report on what's changing. And what I found fascinating as a reporter on many days was sitting in the newsroom and, for example, covering Hurricane Katrina. Now, I was on the desk in Washington. What was really interesting for me was the number of people who, in a separate context was, when I talk about the changing dynamics of a newsroom and the industry, I would say to people, can everyone see what's changing? And what was interesting was, having covered Hurricane Katrina, was it's like sitting on a shoreline with other reporters who are trained to see what's changing, to follow trends and to communicate that to audiences at scale. And I always found it remarkable that people would say, no, it's like in denial of the storm gathering offshore. For me, it felt like sitting on a shoreline, and people who were paid to cover change couldn't see that change coming. And I found that kind of remarkable and I think that's where maybe I was just slightly different to other people, that I applied all of that curiosity and those observations that you needed to, like, we traded on that as reporters, and knowledge workers trade on their knowledge being current to get the best jobs, to attract the right jobs and to keep them, right? That's why high-end knowledge workers have the best gig going around, because they can be selective about the projects they step into if they are trading on their knowledge being current. So they're always upgrading their software, which is, I think, a great lesson for everyone. And there's a lot of data around people who are in full-time jobs not being as dedicated to learning as freelancers, because if freelancers aren't upgrading their software, they don't get the next good gig going. So I think that that's something valuable for all of us, that we need to be paying attention to what's changing and not be distracted by all the things that we could be distracted by. Doom scrolling is a great example. Like, if we switch doom scrolling for actually observing what's really going on around us, that's a way to start paying attention to the signals of change.
Let's put a bookmark in the signals of change, because I want to come back to that.
Yep.
But I want to touch on, you spoke about the skill set of being able to pay attention to what's unfolding as a reporter and how valuable that is professionally. How do you walk the line between paying so much attention to what's happening on the outer world to what's happening on the inner world as Andrea?
I don't believe there's any real reflection, real growth without reflection. And that takes time and that takes space. One thing I've always prioritised is creating space to reflect and process. I've had to process a lot of trauma from what I've seen in the field as a reporter. I've had to process a lot of pain in different ways, and I've always prioritised. I've never ignored that. Change is very personal. There's nothing more personal than change, right? And it can be very emotional because we're human. So I've always accepted that part of that process around accepting change means creating space to reflect, creating space to get professional help if I've ever felt it necessary, creating space to have deep and meaningful conversations with people I trust, because I simply it's difficult to grow without that reflection. And I think the mistake that many of us are making, is not allowing that space in our lives. We're doom scrolling instead of sitting back, journaling, thinking through certain experiences and processing what they meant to us. And I'll give you a good example of one moment where I've never said no to an assignment ever, but there was one moment where I was in Tbilisi in Georgia in about 2009, just after the Russians invaded, just rolled tanks through Georgia, as a power play for sovereignty over that country. And things were still on fire when we arrived. And I arrived as part of an international aid organisation to assess what was going on the ground and make recommendations about how we can help. So arrived there, it's chaos, there's abject poverty, there's a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, talking to people who had been through it all with their houses still on fire. And on that trip, my cameraman and I, Brent, went into an orphanage for mentally and physically disabled kids, and it was traumatizing and it was really distressing. And I came out of that building, that shell of a building, because I couldn't evacuate the kids, so like hundreds of them, came out of that building And I sat down with Brent, and we were both really, we took it really personally what was going on in there. The fact there was hardly any government help, and these young kids who you just knew were never going to get the help that they needed. And I sat outside, and I was emotionally done. And my boss called me from Washington, and he said, "We need you to get on a plane and go to Afghanistan." And I said, "No." I said, here's what I'm doing. I am getting on a plane and going back to DC, and I do not want anyone to contact me for 10 days because I need 10 days to process everything that I'm seeing here. I'm not going to just forget this has happened and move on to the next gig. I'm going to allow myself to be human and do whatever I need to do to really process all of the emotion that is attached to this particular assignment, this particular story. And I think that we all need to find a way to do that. Say no in moments where we know that that moment is really valuable for us to, to process whatever it is we need to process. And instead of just, smashing through and just powering on and doing what we feel like we need to be doing, stepping back and saying, this is what I need for my mental health, I'm going to take it.
Do you think that all of this opportunity you've had to exercise perspective in completely different living conditions and environments and seeing countries that are war-torn, people who are struggling far harder than we can conceptualise living in a lucky country like Australia, it allows you to have that AQ and that little resistance to change?
The only thing I think it allows me to do is, and I've only had small windows of exposure. I haven't been in a war zone for an extended period of time, but long enough to see abject poverty and pain and trauma. And what it's really done is allow me to, first of all, it's a lot to reconcile, because a lot to reconcile to be able to step out of all of that trauma and say, oh, thanks, I'm going back to my first world life. Or thanks, I'm going back to live on the beach in Sydney. Like, that's a lot for me to reconcile. And I still feel like I do that every day in some ways. What it allows me to do is bring perspective immediately to anything that I'm going through. There's always someone that has it way worse than me. And for anyone listening, trust me, there is always someone that has it way worse than you. I think that perspective is really important when we're making difficult decisions and when we're feeling really challenged and feeling like our world is caving in. You have to remind yourself that perspective is everything, and that we can be. There's always hope, and you have to find a way to balance that with the reality of what you're going through. And I think bringing that perspective to my life routinely is a really helpful one to have.
I want to talk about change and when it doesn't always work out the way that you pictured it. Mm-hmm. You had a story that you told in the book. You moved to Kira for the quiet life. For those who don't know where Kira is on the southern part of Queensland.
It's the best beach break, best surf break in the country, really.
Actually, we've seen some great footage of it in the last couple of weeks.
Epic swells,
after the cyclone, after Alfred.
Yeah.
But, when you're in that moment, you're recognising that maybe this change isn't what I'd hyped it up to be. Mm-hmm. How do you acquire the ability to accept that fact and move forward from it without it scarring you and jarring your ability to make decisions again in the future?
You make decisions with the best of intentions and with as much information that you have at the time. But often when you find yourself in a new scenario, there's new information. And that new information changes the game. I moved up to the Gold Coast because my younger sister had breast cancer, and I really wanted to be closer to her and closer to my family through that. And so I moved to Kira, and I thought I could probably stay here long term because it's magnificent. There's an airport 2 k's away. And what I found after a year, and Sally actually said to me, she said, "Okay, I'm okay now. Like, if you want to go, you can go. You're kind of all clear from my point of view," which I needed to hear out loud. And things changed. I mean, I felt increasingly isolated. And I did a values exercise. I did a values audit. And I reminded myself that my values were anchored around learning and community. And I didn't feel like either of those values were being satisfied in that particular context. And I thought, well, it's okay for me to, move back to Sydney, move back to a suburb where I felt a strong sense of community and a strong sense of an ability to learn. So there's nothing wrong with, and it wasn't the wrong decision. It was the right decision at the time. Like often we make decisions at the time that feel right because they are right in that moment. And when we get new information, treat it as new information and treat it as a learning experience and an opportunity for growth.
I want to ask you a question about community, because I think community is more important to people than maybe they realise at certain times in their life. I remember sitting in New York having a coffee by myself on a solo trip to the US for a couple of weeks. Sitting down having a coffee, reminiscing on the trip, and one thing that I really missed just in 2 weeks of being away was I missed my community, my people. Not so much from a locality perspective, but rather from the way that the environment and the things that I'm used to in Australia set me up for a good day. And maybe that's a little bit of fragility and attachment to routine and the things around me. But at the time, I was actually contemplating a move to London because there wasn't really anything holding me down in my area anymore.
Yep, I know the feeling.
And I sat there and I thought about, what's really important to me?
Yeah.
And one of the 5 pillars I identified that I feel are important for me to live a fulfilling life is environment.
Yeah.
And the way that the place that exists around me makes me feel. So what is it about Sydney that makes you feel at home?
It's interesting you say that because I have given this a lot of thought and I've lived in a lot of places. I'm contemplating a big move now. And so I'm doing a lot of reflecting on this. I think there are some places that just make you feel good. And I know that there's some connection that we have to some places that I think are deep and spiritual and natural, feel easy. And my environment's really important for me as well. And I know I need to be feeling like I can, like wherever I'm living I need to feel like I've got a connection to that place and it's supportive of me and how I want to feel about myself. So, sorry, what was the question? I've just blanked.
What is it about Sydney that gives you that?
Manly. So I first moved to Sydney I was a cadet reporter at Channel 10 in the year 2000. So I've been in and out of Sydney many times. I visited Manly, 10 years ago and thought, wow, if only I could afford to live here, because I felt a sense of peace. I felt a sense of community. And I felt a sense of, I feel like it's just sacred land. It's really sacred in every sense of the word. And I felt a strong sense of connection to that particular suburb, but I couldn't afford to live there. Like it was a dream. And then I had a moment. I actually went to Harvard I took myself to Harvard for an executive education program. And that was the moment where I realised, I need to be in a different environment because being in Melbourne was holding me back. And it's a valid question to be asking. What is holding you back, even in very small ways in your life? And that was a question that was confronted through an exercise called the Immunity to Change, which is a Harvard exercise. You should search it up if you haven't done it. It's pretty powerful. And what it asks of you is, what are you worried about? Like, what is holding you back and what are you worried about if you actually get to where you want to be? And that was the moment I decided to pack up my life in Melbourne and move to a suburb that I felt was going to give me peace and opportunity at the same time.
I want to ask you something, and this is a pivot, so this is where my brain works.
I might just add something to that.
Yeah, add something.
So I moved up in 2017, I think, and my business was really busy. I was doing 110 flights a year, running leadership training to big companies around the country. And this is how I knew I really was sort of addicted to Manly, is that every morning when I'd be picked up, and I've had the same driver for, almost 10 years, every time Lake would pick me up in the morning, it would be really early and the sun would be rising and I'd catch a glimpse of the surf and the sun in the morning as we drove out of Manly. And it was so painful for me every day I really felt a sense of FOMO and that I really just didn't want to be leaving. And that's how I knew I was in the right place, that I just hated leaving, and I love coming back. Whenever I travel, there's nothing that makes me happier than coming back. to that place. So, and if you feel that about where you are, you're in the right place. Yeah.
I love that. It's funny, people of the Illawarra, where I'm from, often talk about the feeling you get when you hit the top of Mount Ousley and start to roll down. You see that view, and it's like, I'm home.
We all have a version of that. Yeah.
We do. Sometimes it's in people. I feel that with
That's
my partner,
true.
which is nice.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about one of the 4 principles of ADAPT that you speak about is release.
Yeah.
There's a story that has fascinated me. I'm going to absolutely tell you it at risk of pissing off the audience for the 1000th time they've heard it. But it's a story of the statue of David. When David was sculpted, and I won't go into the full story because it's long, but when it was sculpted from the piece of stone, someone asked how something so beautiful can be created from such a large piece of stone. And the comment was that David was always seen in the stone, just needed to remove everything that wasn't him.
Oh, wow, I love it. I haven't heard that. That's amazing.
It's amazing. Yeah. The thing that interests me about this and this topic of release is I think that to change and to move in new directions in life, you definitely do have to scale back what has once been a part of you and a part of your life. And I think that there's a notion that comes from the self-help world of add skill, add skill, add skill, add skill, add this to your life. Here's new information. But without ever decompressing or deleting the junk, it's hard to just continue to add things to a world of responsibility that already feels so full. So talk to me about why that principle was so important to you and while it served such a huge part of the book.
First of all, that's so true. You just have cognitive overload. You can't keep adding. You've got to think about, what am I dialing down while I'm dialing up something else at the same time? And I want to actually share an exercise with you from Release, if you don't mind.
Yes, let's go.
So Don Price, who wrote a fantastic foreword to my book, is a work futurist at Atlassian. And I've actually used his exercise in here. It's obviously attributed to him. And it's about the 5 L's. And this is in the Release chapter.
Yeah, like the 5 Ds of dodgeball.
Probably
Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge.
I love that. It's similar but different. Yeah. So this is a high AQ habit for everyone who's watching and listening. And essentially, it's called the 5 L's, and I run the 5 L's every quarter with a great friend of mine, Stevie, who's one of my very closest besties. Okay, and here's what the 5 L's is about. It's asking yourself, like, pick a timeline, pick a window. So I'm going to reflect on the last 4 weeks, which is good because the book came out about 4 weeks ago, right? So everyone asks themselves these questions. What have I loved about my work over that time period? And what do I want to keep doing more of in the future? What can I double down on? So what have you loved? What have you longed for? What do you wish you'd had over whatever timeline you want to reflect on? This could be more real life events. It could be more exercise. Could be more coffee. No judgment. Like, what have you longed for? What have you loathed? I love this question. What has made life harder? What was deeply irritating? What do you hope will never happen again? What did you learn? What have you learned from your successes and your mistakes? And what have you laughed at? What has made you belly laugh? Because if we're not having fun, like, what is the point? So just think about it. What's one action you'll take to remove something from your loathed list? What's one action you'll take to amplify something from your loved list? And use longed for, learned, and laughed at lists to help you shape your ideas for what actions to take. It's really simple, isn't it? Just run the 5 L's.
Do you want to play this together?
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it. Like, what have you loved? So pick a time period, pick a window.
We'll do the last month or two.
Okay, cool.
I think that's very relevant.
What have you loved?
The frequency of this.
Oh, what's the frequency of it?
This week 5.
Okay.
Which is great.
Yep.
Not every week is it like that, but certainly having the studio, having the efficiency, having a great team, we've been able to sort of double down on recordings, and I love this. Like, this fills my cup.
So can you keep recording at the same frequency?
I don't think 5 a week, but certainly 2 to 3
That's
a week.
Yeah,
2 to 3 a week.
Okay.
Which for me, 1 a week doesn't feel like enough.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't feel like enough.
No.
And so, what have you longed for? What do you wish you'd had in the last 4 weeks?
Date nights with Soph.
Okay, right. Put it in the diary.
Mm.
Get it in the diary, Soph. Good one. What have you loathed? What has made life harder? What's been irritating? What do you hope will never happen again?
Editing.
Oh, yeah.
I will say editing and I don't mind the travel up, but the travel's a lot. Like today, these days are big days. I leave home at, I left at 6:15 this morning. I'll get home at 7 tonight.
Yeah.
They become big days where it's mentally relatively draining.
Yeah.
For as much fun and enjoyment as I have, traveling 4 to 5 hours around
Can you stay locally overnight somewhere? Even
Not really. A bit hard.
It is a bit hard.
Bit hexy on the old bank account with a wedding coming up. But
oh, yeah, sure. But that's something that you might be able to change down the track.
Yeah, for sure. And editing, which in the process of changing that
okay.
right now.
What have you learned in the last month?
This is a great question. Something I've been reflecting on quite a lot, which I think I can lose my way with at times, is... Heard the story of the prodigal son?
Yeah, not for a while, but...
Guy Ritchie, another thing that listeners have heard too many times. Guy Ritchie talks about this story and how he perceives it. You are the father, the older son is your intellect, the youngest son is the part of you that needs to go out and, for lack of a better phrase, prostitute yourself to the world to figure out what it's about, to realise that so many of the things that you gain along the way are transitory and ephemeral in order to come back to yourself and realise you're enough in the first place. Yeah. When you are running this kind of show in a very competitive market, as someone who doesn't have a success history behind them that sells a podcast straight away, you're always looking to grow and prosper so that you can do more of this because you love it. And sometimes in seeing what's successful, you find yourself falling into the fold. I had a moment last week where I stopped and I said, you know what, this show is the best. I enjoy it the most when I come back to who I am, and just very much so lean into authenticity. And so relearning that all the time.
And that'll never stop.
No.
That'll never stop. You always have moments of reinforcement when you come back to who you are. And for me, that just parallels with what you love and doubling down on this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you laughed at? What have you laughed out loud at?
Oh, Barney.
Oh, Barney.
He has his moments, man. He has his moments. He's I sent you a photo the other night when we were talking about
Barney.
him. Of him just lying on the lounge stretched out like
a
king when you come home to him. So that's one of the best things about dogs. They make you take life less seriously.
They're a joy machine.
They are, except when they're pissing on things. But God, you learn some patience.
So what are you going to remove from your... So can you remove something from your loathe list?
Yeah, the editing.
Right? Awesome. And what can you amplify from your loved list? You can double down on this.
Double down on this.
Great.
Double down on
See how easy
double
it is
down on
change
Barney,
your life in
all the good things.
In 5 L's. I love it.
Can I ask you the same questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to look back. So it's been a month. The last month. What's the day today? It's been 4 weeks since the book came out.
4th of April.
Okay. What have I loved about the last 4 weeks? What I love about writing and releasing a book is meeting people. I love it. I just love it so hard. So that's what I've really loved most about the last month is meeting, people who I've intentionally wanted to meet. Like, there's a lot I've said no to because I don't think there was an alignment, but I love meeting people. I love the conversations I have. That's what I've loved in the last month. Long for... how much time have we got? I'll keep it simple, and that is I've longed for just more exercise. Actually, like I've let that go a little bit in the last month because I've been pretty exhausted by everything that's been going on.
What's your exercise drug of choice?
I'm addicted to walking, Pilates, and ocean swimming.
Fuck, how good's a walk?
A walk is everything.
Ocean swim too. I love the salt water.
Anything where I don't have my phone. But walking is... I couldn't have written my first book without walking 7Ks a day. The research is so clear around... our creativity is boosted by 60% when we walk 30 minutes or longer. It's remarkable. So I started walking about 7 years ago and it has changed my life. So...
Love that.
Yeah. So just that... Because your neurons start rewiring. So anyway, if you can give yourself half an hour a day, I try to walk for an hour a day, but that's what I should have done more of in the last month. What have I loathed? I have loathed my imposter syndrome. I've loathed it. The weekend before the book came out, I just found myself spiraling, like with self-doubt and imposter syndrome. And I loathe it. It's such an unbelievable waste of time. And So, I hope that doesn't happen again. I really had to,
Let me ask you one thing on that.
I had to work on that. Yeah.
This isn't your first book. It's your second.
It's not. No.
Did you experience that after the first?
Yeah, I did, for sure. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Just a what am I doing moment.
Yeah.
And have I got everything in order? Have I cited the right studies? And I went into a deep spiral about not citing one particular Harvard study strongly enough. And it's those small things that keep, a journalist awake at night. So I've loathed that, and I've promised myself never to go through that again because it's just such a waste of time. What have I learned in the last month? That's a really good one, isn't it?
It is.
I've learned that I love to write, but I've learned I just really love to write more than most things in life. And what have I laughed at? I was having this conversation, hanging around Don Price makes me laugh out loud every time, and I love that. So he actually lives in my neighbourhood, but he's got two of the most gorgeous twins and amazing wife. So he doesn't have much time, but I feel like I need to find more Doms in my life to make me laugh out loud. So I think that's it. So to remove something from my loathe list is not very difficult.
Yeah.
But I think that's hopefully a great exercise for everyone listening.
I think that's a brilliant exercise.
So actionable.
I'm so glad we covered that. Can I pull the bookmark out and go back to one last thing before we finish?
Yeah.
Because we're very closing in on the time that we need to wrap this up.
Let's do it.
But I just want to ask, you spoke about the signals of change, seeing the storm coming.
Yeah.
When you look out on the horizon right now, what's just at least one thing that you see in the storm that you think people should be aware of and starting to take real stock of?
One thing that concerns me is connection and community. We're dealing with a workplace that's more fragmented. We're dealing with an entire segment of the population that's been given more autonomy and more agency. What we're not doing enough of is replacing the workplace sense of community. I think we all need to work harder to find that sense of belonging, to check on people around us, and to make sure that we're pulling in the tribe constantly. We just, I've just decided to have pizza night at my place every Tuesday night. Invite my neighbours over.
Cooking at home or ordering in?
No, ordering pocket pizza. Okay. The best pizza going around on the Northern Beaches. What concerns me in terms of a signal of change and what is changing is we're all doom scrolling. We're all even unintentionally becoming more distracted and less connected from one another. And I think we all need to find a way, if we can all just do one thing every week that pulls in the tribe. I think that's an important signal to be paying attention to. Like, how can we be an active player in building a stronger sense of community and belonging where we are?
I love it. Such a good point. I'm so upset that our time's run up because we could have kept doing this for an hour or two. I do want to quickly say for everyone listening, Adapt, go check it out. Any good bookstore. I listened to it. You sent me a copy, which was so great of you. And I also listened to it. You've got a great voice for it. You tell great stories. It is not dry in the slightest. It is such an enjoyable listen for anyone who wants to consume it that way. I hope this podcast has been enough of a encouragement, a little tap on the arse for people to go ahead and check this out in its full greatness. So,
thank you,
Andrea. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad. So great to be here.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.